My name's Alex Wagner. I'm happy to be joined on stage with two really provocative, interesting thinkers, people with great experience on the issue. To my far right, far left, is Leon Rodriguez, who is a partner at Seyfarth Shaw and particularly relevant to this conversation, the former director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services in the Department of Homeland Security from the years 2014 to 2017. And then to my immediate left is Reihan Salam, who is the president of the Manhattan Institute, a relatively new position. Congratulations, Reihan. And he is a National Review Institute Policy Fellow and a contributing editor at The Atlantic and National Affairs. He is a busy man. Thank you for joining me, gents.
Thanks for having us.
Let's get right to it. The topic of immigration, and specifically the crisis of immigration, has been in the news a lot. Leon, I want to get your thoughts, given the fact that you worked with refugees from Syria and other parts of the Mideast. When you look at what is happening to the children on the border of the U.S. and Mexico, is there a case to be made that these are not refugees? What kind of resources are allocated to refugees that we're not seeing allocated to these children?
Right. Well, they're not refugees in the technical legal sense of the term, and that makes a big difference in what their experience is going to be. So when we talk about refugees from Syria, they come within the jurisdiction of the United Nations and of the host countries, and therefore they have an entire suite of both services and legal supports that come to them that really aren't immediately available to the folks that we're seeing coming up from Central America. They housing, they have legal support in terms of being able to enter the refugee process, and they're then being referred to different countries for admission as refugees. It's also important to know look at the numbers in comparison. So we're talking, even as we speak today, there are 3 million Syrian refugees, most of them in the eastern part of Turkey, 2 million in Jordan, about 1 million in Lebanon, concentrated in Beirut. So the loads we're talking about are much, much larger than what we're dealing with at the border, but the resources to address those loads are much greater than what we're seeing. What we're seeing at the border are people who are coming to our border requesting asylum, so they're not going through what is a comparatively, and I don't want to describe it as orderly, it is only comparatively orderly because you have all this other process before they even reach the border of the country they're trying to get to.
But it does beg the question, what is a refugee, and do we need to have a more expansive definition of refugees, right? I mean, Reihan, we frame what's happening in the border as an immigration crisis, but a lot of people will say it's a humanitarian crisis. And I'm going to sit up very straight.
That wasn't censorship, was it?
That was Putin. In the coming years, as the climate crisis worsens and there are more climate refugees, I mean, the question is this truly immigration policy, or is this humanitarian aid that we need to think of?
This is a really important question. When you're looking at migrants in general, you oftentimes see a blend of economic concerns, humanitarian concerns, and much else, and trying to draw a bright line across these is really, really hard. Think back to 2015, when Europe experienced a very, very big migrant crisis. One thing that was really fascinating about 2015 is that you, of course, had folks from Syria, from Iraq, from those kind of very serious civil conflicts who were heading to Europe. What's striking, however, is that a very large number of people who were coming to Europe in 2015 were coming from the Maghreb. They were coming from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, from other societies where you certainly have a lot of poverty, you have a lot of displacement, but you didn't necessarily have the kind of discrete crisis that people tend to think of when they think of a refugee humanitarian crisis. So what exactly was happening there? One thing I would argue is that when you're thinking about migrants, we have this tendency to think of migrants as kind of automatons who just kind of move across the landscape as if they were flotsam or jetsam, rather than thinking people who have their own social networks. They have information that travels through their social networks. So why did you have this large wave of folks from Pakistan and Bangladesh and Morocco, for example, coming to Europe in 2015 rather than 2014 or 2013 or 2012, periods of time when you had a lot of gender inequality and poverty and domestic violence and many other problems besides? One argument is that what you saw is that in 2015, through migrant networks, you see that people see a policy change. They sense some kind of policy change in the receiving countries, whether that is a formal or explicit policy change or an informal change in terms of how enforcement actually operates in practice. So when you're thinking about migrant waves in general, you have to keep in mind, migrants are not just mindless, they're human beings like you and me. And like any other human being, they're thinking about their opportunities, they're thinking about the risks that they're likely to face. And so in 2015, you had a lot of folks who thought, this is our opportunity to take a chance and see what happens. And I think that when you see similarly at the US-Mexico border, there has been both a shift in policy, and there's also been a shift in terms of how migrants themselves are thinking about their opportunities. And I can talk about that at greater length.
Well, but Leon, so the numbers we've seen in terms of migrants going to the border have dramatically increased. The increase began under President Obama, but it seems to have reached its pitch right now under this administration. To Raihan's point, how much of that is Trump's rhetoric about closing the border, about increasing tariffs to Mexico, making the entry process that much harder or potentially non-existent? How much is that driving? The current and huge wave of migrants coming north?
So I think we knew what the fundamental drivers were when the first surges of migration started in the Obama administration. And let's say right here, it was partly economic. We shouldn't deny that it was partly economic. I would argue that the economic conditions that drive what is labeled economic migration is often partnered with political public safety conditions that in fact mirror the kinds of circumstances that give rise to refugee and asylum claims. That, in the early part of the Obama administration, it surges, we take some actions to try to depress that flow, it dips, and then it surges back up again. Then President Trump takes office. Rhetoric is very aggressive with respect to the migrants. We see actually a very dramatic drip to a point where the administration is essentially ready to declare victory. In fact, is making some pretty triumphant statements about what it had accomplished, and then it really dramatically surges in recent years, year or so. Where I caution here is I don't think we 100% know what caused this most recent surge. I think it's certainly part of it is this idea that the borders may at some time close.
Yeah.
That certainly is a discussion that I think does occur in the migrant social networks that Raihan described. Certainly, I think smugglers play a pretty significant role in that traffic, and certainly they probably fan those flames of fear and concern and anxiety. I worry that there are reasons that we're not perceiving because we're not necessarily in a position to really study what those reasons are, or that to the extent that our law enforcement and intelligence services have some awareness of what those reasons are beyond what we all know publicly, that's not something that's been shared with us, so that we really have a more comprehensive understanding of
the Trump administration has been very clear that their deterrence policy is going to be sort of, let's say, punitive. Well, it's a deterrent policy, right? I want to talk about what happened yesterday, which was very big news in terms of the way these agencies operate that are tasked with carrying out the policy. The president, as you know, has a policy that forces asylum seekers to remain in Mexico while their claims are being processed. Yesterday, the labor union that represents the officers that are charged with enforcing that policy came out with a public statement condemning the Trump administration's policy and calling it fundamentally contrary to the moral fabric of our nation. A lot of people who watched that unfold said that was an explicit rebuke to the acting head of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, Ken Cuccinelli, who is an immigration hardliner. You were the former head of USCIS. What was your reaction to that?
Well, I thought it spoke volumes. I think there is a serious, I don't think anybody debates that there's a serious crisis in Central America. I view the border as a symptom, not as the only crisis that's going on. I think the fact that civil servants would essentially take a position in court against their employer, it's not unheard of. In fact, there are many times when public employee unions take political positions contrary to their employing agency, but to take the step of filing in this manner and basically debating the factual basis for the agency's
And framing it as a moral issue.
In framing it as a moral issue, that is a huge and, again, not unprecedented, but it is extraordinary.
I must say I don't find it very huge, partly because when you're thinking about organized labor in this context, the unions representing folks who work for Border Patrol, for various other agencies, for ICE, they've taken a variety of positions that I think reflect very sensibly the institutional interests of the employees. And I think that we ought to approach it cautiously when we think about the unions, how they approach the Obama administration's policies, how other unions have approached interior enforcement policies. It's useful to think about it in broader context, and making a moral argument is a way of rising above the din and kind of making your voice heard.
I would agree.
Forgive me, I do want to address a kind of larger issue, and Leon touched on many really interesting and important questions. One very crude, reductive model is to think about the cost of migrating from one place to another. And this cost can, in many cases, be informal, the smuggler's price. You mentioned smuggling. Now, one of the really fascinating developments in recent years has been the rise of the so-called migrant caravan. And there's been a lot of controversy around this, a lot of talk around this, but one way to think about the migrant caravan is simply that you go from having to pay a smuggler's price, which can represent a very substantial share of your income, depending on where it is you're coming from, the circumstances, et cetera, to a situation where that price goes down. It doesn't go down to zero, because there's still the risk that's involved in making that journey and what have you. But that's a really significant change, because again, there's that classic idea. If something becomes cheaper, you're a lot more likely to do it. There are other really interesting, Leon was talking about some of the other drivers of migration. Think about it this way. If you have several families in a rural area, one family has a family member who is working as a migrant in another country where that person gets higher wages. Suddenly you've introduced a new inequality into that rural community, because someone is bringing income from the outside, and that could have all kinds of complicated effects. Suddenly, one person has more of a ability to buy land, to buy other resources, to sustain the income of the family. There can be a kind of keeping up with the Joneses effect. And so therefore, it creates a kind of migrant cascade in which other people feel obliged. They have to have a family member do that. And then eventually, the cost of migration goes down in another sense. When you have your compatriots, when you have people from your local village, from your country, living in another country, suddenly it's less scary. Suddenly it becomes easier to navigate the labor market and much else. And then eventually you also have an effect on the home country too, because in many cases, a lot of those folks who would have been the bulwarks of civic life, they're not necessarily there. So countries where they're trying to get a hold on law and order, they're trying to actually build up their civil society, they're trying to build up their institutions, guess what? They're actually oftentimes losing some of the people who are going to be the most economically active.
I do think we need to be careful, though, Raihan, in terms of framing this as a keeping up with the Joneses situation. I am not a person who has interviewed every migrant family, but at least anecdotally, and of course anecdotes are one thing, reality is another, these are people fleeing persecution and violence. And they are terrified for their lives, and they are willing to risk
Alex, I think it's really dangerous to trivialize the economic changes that happen in people's lives. That kind of changes
I did not trivialize it, I'm just cautioning framing this as solely an economic issue.
It's a good thing that also, you have to think about the violence, but also you have to think about how violence relates to state capacity, right? So that's another thing.
So let's talk about state capacity, Leon, because one of the decisions the Trump administration has announced is to cut off aid to the Northern Triangle countries, including Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. A lot of critics of that proposal say these are the very programs that we need to be strengthening. They deal with violence, justice, their civil society programs. They're exactly the things that would be building infrastructure on the ground in these countries to help keep people safe and in their native countries.
I mean, that's why both people within his own administration and people within his own political coalition really had serious problems with that step. I mean, we're talking right now, every single country that is sending these, or where migrants are coming our way, every single one of them has really scary travel warnings posted by our State Department that basically indicate that their law enforcement institutions are completely broken. To the extent that we pull back aid, that means those law enforcement institutions will even be more degraded, more prone to corruption, more prone to brutality. And then the problems that are sending people here, and I'm one who believes fundamentally they're going to keep coming no matter how big a wall we build, no matter how many green uniformed Border Patrol agents we put out there, they're going to keep coming because the reasons for coming are much greater than the reasons for not coming. And I think Raihan has actually hit a lot of a lot of the reasons and a lot of the sort of unseen reasons for that. So I think that was a huge mistake. A lot of people thought it was a huge mistake. If anything, where I would like to see the United States be is really exercising leadership. This is something where there really is a pretty decently broad political consensus in principle, where I don't think we have consensus in how much we're willing to spend.
Yeah.
I agree with Leon. I agree strongly with Leon on this. When you're thinking about the long-term strategy for dealing with migration from the region, a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that actually this region is actually aging pretty rapidly. So when you're thinking about the long term, when you're thinking about 10, 20 years from now, that's going to really change the migration picture. So the thinking is, how do we get to a point where we can help stabilize these societies? And some of that is going to be helping them to build up their state capacity. There are many things that go into that. But one argument that I've been making for a while is the argument that the United States really needs to build a stronger partnership, not just with the Central American states, but also with Mexico. Mexico is a country that is becoming an upper middle income country. It's a country that has, kind of very different labor market needs. It's a country that, kind of, if we were to help them get to a better place, could really do a tremendous job of helping easing some of these migratory pressures.
Do you think on the Mexico front?
Forgive me, Alex, just one little thing to note about the migration question, about the economic dimension, is that one really funny thing is that it's actually not the poorest of the poor countries that have huge amounts of emigration. It's actually above a certain economic threshold where you start seeing immigration, and it makes intuitive sense, right? Because you need some money in order to migrate. You also might need some communications. You might have some sense of what the world looks like outside your immediate area. So that's one reason why this is such a tricky issue. There really are dire humanitarian issues. But it's also the case that in some cases, migration opportunities are more available to you when you have some more resources at your disposal, which is why Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is a place where you're about to see a huge wave of immigration that's going to have huge effects on the world.
When we talk about resource allocation, Leon, there are two bills, one in the House, one in the Senate, each got passed, allocating about $4.6 billion of aid, specifically to the crisis unfolding on the border. The children have become the flashpoint for that. The House bill is more restrictive in terms of how those funds can be used compared to the Senate bill. It's unclear which one's going to gain final passage. There's some thought that the Senate bill stands a better chance of not getting vetoed by the White House. Critics of the House bill say, look, you can't lay over all these stipulations about how this money can be spent. Let the agencies do their work. Do you think there's a risk in sort of hamstringing the agencies, or is there a greater risk that the Trump administration is going to use the money to carry out their idea of how the border should be made safe?
I mean, I hate to say it. I think there's a risk in any path you take. One of the big things that where the House differs from the Senate is in demanding, one, restrictions on the money, but also in demanding certain minimal conditions of due process, certain minimal conditions of sort of the amenities made available when people are in detention or otherwise sort of in some notion of custody by the immigration services. I think the problem where this all gets really hard is they're overwhelmed, and they're probably still going to be overwhelmed after this bill passes. And so, for example, that's one reason why I always really take issue when the anger about the situation is directed at the agents on the ground and on their managers, because they are managing a situation way beyond what they're actually equipped to address. They weren't designed in terms of how they're deployed on the border, how they're staffed to address situations of this magnitude. So I probably would end up alongside the Senate bill, where I don't think we should deceive ourselves is that we're not still going to have huge problems even after that. Even if that does pass.
Again, in terms of resources that we are allocating or not, and the sort of economic questions that are enmeshed with the immigration debate, Raihan, you talk about Mexico and the United States strengthening that partnership as a way to curb some of this immigration. What did you make of the president's plan to impose punitive tariffs on Mexico if they didn't stop migrant refugees from coming over the border?
My initial instinct is that this is a mistake. This is an incredibly important economic relationship. One thing that is striking is that the Mexican state seem to respond in some ways. There's a lot of debate around this. Certainly critics of the president have said, gosh, these are things that would have happened regardless. The Mexican government was already cooperating. This is entirely superficial and symbolic. There's kind of other reason to believe that perhaps there was indeed some political urgency, given that for the López Obrador administration, kind of this gave them another reason to not kind of backslide on some of those commitments. So it's really hard for me to say. Overall, long term, I believe that you need to have a thriving Mexico, and a Mexico that is going to be a Mexico that could actually absorb a lot more migrant labor. One thing that López Obrador has talked about is the idea that we want to be a place that's going to welcome asylum seekers and what have you. And I think that that also means Mexico has to deal with some of its own rule of law challenges, some of its own crime problems. This is a little bit further afield. But also, there are about 1 million US citizens who reside in Mexico right now. It's a large number of people. And that's a number of people that could increase substantially if the United States and Mexico had some kind of compact on retiree migration, for example, something along those lines, where you could create a really labor-intensive services industry in Mexico that could complement some of our need to address the needs of an aging population. So I think that there are a lot of things that the US and Mexico can do long term. In the short term, the truth is that President Trump is a very unpredictable person. And I think that it's oftentimes unpredictable what the response on the part of other countries is going to be to what he does. My guess is as good as yours as to exactly how that's going to unfold.
We've focused in the talk so far on immigration about what's happening at the border, but as it concerns immigration inside the United States, the president has recently made former head of ICE, Mark Morgan, the acting head of Customs and Border Patrol. Morgan is a proponent, a supporter of the announced planned raids on undocumented citizens in this country. When you first heard about these raids, what was your thinking in terms of their efficacy and beyond?
My first thinking was really actually to the families that were going to be affected by those raids. I mean, the reality is, and we'll acknowledge that there are some legal issues that relate to how they first got here, why they've remained here. But at the end of the day, my first reaction went to what a horrible weekend this is going to be for those families, many of which include U.S. citizens, and in those communities where these things are going to happen. I also thought it was really just bad law enforcement tactic to just sort of announce this big raid just before you're going to do it.
We're coming for you.
Yeah, so I'm thinking if I'm vulnerable and I'm in one of the 6 target cities, I'm going to Disney World because,
Right.
So those were my initial reactions. I'm gonna go parenthetical for just a second here because I think this is the Ideas Festival, and there is an idea we've talked about where Rayhan and I, there is some real common thinking here, and it needs to be highlighted because I think it needs to really get into our national discussion, and that is the importance of constructive engagement and leadership by our government with the countries from where the migrants are coming or where they're passing through. And that has, to date, been sorely absent from our policy approach to the issues that we're seeing.
That brings to the fore a sort of more philosophical question about handling a crisis. And Leon, I would love to know from your experience and your life, what you think is, what works. I mean, the posture of this administration has been the stick, right? With these other countries, we're going to take the aid away, we're going to impose punitive tariffs, we're going to conduct raids on undocumented communities. And yet the stoking of fear has resulted in people driven, it sounds like if you're an undocumented citizen, you hear about these raids, you go further underground.
Undocumented migrant, you mean?
No, I'm talking about in the United States, if you hear about planned raids.
But they're not citizens, right?
Sorry, undocumented residents in this country, your reaction is to go further underground, to go to Disneyland. And if you are a family looking to migrate to the United States, you come all the more quicker. You come in larger numbers. So does fear work as a tool? It seems highly unclear, and that's probably being generous.
Fear always needs to be understood in terms of what the choices are with which you are faced. And again, I remember meeting a migrant family in Mexico whose intention was to come here to the U.S. And they wanted to tell me their story. And what they told me is that they had the reason they left was that they had a teenage daughter who was being pursued by the gangs, and I didn't know where exactly they were from, but they were being pursued by the gangs either to be pressed into a condition of concubinage, basically be the concubine of one of the gang members, or prostitution, or a combination of the two. And you just have to think about this as a parent. If that's the situation with which your child is faced, how much fear, how much discomfort, how much risk are you willing to endure to avoid that? I think that's the same calculus that every undocumented person in the United States is making in some way. They are afraid it is a very understandably stressful way to live your life, knowing that if you are pulled over, if you go to the hospital in certain situations, any situation where you may be interacting with officialdom is a situation that puts you at risk of discovery and possibly arrest and deportation. And so it's a question of which fear is worse, being deported back to the conditions that sent you here in the first place, incarceration, or the fear of just being caught here illegally. And I think for a lot of people, the calculus is they're willing to endure that fear because of the fear of of the alternative is worse.
One thing that I think is really helpful when you're thinking about the unauthorized migrant population in the United States is to make some distinctions. There is a pretty significant number of folks who enter the country as unauthorized migrants who've since been regularized in some form or another. And there's a lot of inequity in how that process works. So
when you say regularized, what do you mean?
Granted some kind of legal status. So when you're looking at folks who are unauthorized in the US, you can put folks into a couple of broad categories. There's those who've overstayed a visa, and there are those who are clandestine border crossers. Now, one funny thing is that if you are someone who later marries a US citizen, if you are someone who is a visa overstayer, it's a lot easier for you to regularize your status than if you were a clandestine border crosser. Because if you fall in that latter camp, you, quote unquote, entered the country without inspection. So when you're looking at a lot of communities where you have a lot of folks who are unauthorized, you'll actually see this situation where people who think of themselves as really similar to someone else. I have one friend who had 10 best friends growing up in a small city in the eastern part of LA County. And all of them came in the country as unauthorized. 8 of them, their status was regularized eventually. He is someone who's now married to a US citizen who also grew up in that community. But he has really struggled with this because of that slight difference. So there are all kinds of interesting arbitrary differences. Or when you look at some of the legislative proposals for the DACA-eligible population, folks who enter the country as minors, one thing that's striking is that, you can gain status under many of these legislative proposals if you are unauthorized. But let's say you were someone whose parents came in with a guest worker visa of some kind. Then that doesn't apply to you. So there are all of these complicated ways in which the system makes these fine distinctions. And there are a lot of folks who kind of find them pretty arbitrary, and I think that that's something that can be pretty frustrating. Another really important thing to keep in mind is that the unauthorized migrant population is dynamic. It changes over time because there are a lot of folks who then wind up returning home to their native country. Particularly for folks of Mexican origin, that's something that's become somewhat more common. And so then when you get the rest of the population, it's a residual population of folks, Leon was referencing this, many of whom who have ties to US citizens, either in the form of US citizen children, or they might have spouses, or what have you. So there's a lot of complexity with these so-called mixed status families. And I think that, in some ways you could argue that some of these enforcement policies have wound up being somewhat effective. That's why you see some attrition in some parts of the unauthorized immigrant population. On the other hand, what I would argue about the raids that Leon was referring to before is that particularly for folks on the political right, there's this really difficult puzzle. There are people who want immigration enforcement, but many argue the most effective kind of enforcement would be workplace-based enforcement. However, there are many employers who really strongly resist workplace enforcement. So when you're looking at Republicans who characterize themselves as wanting a hardline immigration policy, what you'll often find is that actually many of them do not want mandatory E-Verify. They do not want more stringent workplace enforcement policies. And so that's why you'll oftentimes get a greater emphasis on policies that might wind up actually being less effective in the long run, because those are things that actually divide the political coalition. So I think that when you're looking at these issues, it's helpful to look look below the level of rhetoric and add what are the incentives facing different elected officials, what are their electoral coalitions, and how is that shaping where they place their emphasis on the question of enforcement.
I think that's a very interesting point. I do wonder in the context of this president, though, whether there isn't an explicitly sort of racial underpinning to a lot of the ways the undocumented population or the would-be undocumented population is dealt with. I mean, and I'm speaking specifically of the rhetoric from the president. Do you see that at all? Ryan?
I think that he certainly has used really insensitive language. I also think that we're in a moment where language is just this prism, right? So there are different things, different conversations people have in different contexts, and it's oftentimes going to be interpreted really differently. But I think that, for example, referring to people as animals, that's something that I think is deeply hurtful and incendiary. There are some people
or shithole countries.
Oh, sure, absolutely, insulting some countries of origin, particularly given that there are a lot of Americans who come from countries that were, kind of places that are poor, that don't have a ton of rule of law and what have you. That's been true for a very long time. So I think that, of course, that alienates people. What's also striking, however, is that because of the president's rhetoric, there are a lot of people who would agree with him on some of his core ideas, who then are turned off by his rhetoric. One thing that you see in American politics is the fact that public opinion is thermostatic. What that means is that, under Barack Obama, towards the end of his presidency, the American public was more conservative than it had been since Dwight Eisenhower. Now, since Donald Trump first announced his presidential campaign in 2015, the public has moved to the left on immigration. That's kind of funny, right? You would think that that wouldn't happen, but in a way, it's a reaction to that rhetoric. And then some folks think, aha, this is the new consensus. This is where the new public opinion is. But actually, that's not necessarily true. It could be a thermostatic reaction to someone who's a very widely known public figure. In New York State, the state legislature recently approved driver's licenses for unauthorized migrants. Now, the thing that's really striking is that this, and we can debate the merits of that policy, and I think there are plenty of good arguments to be made there. But actually, this was not a majority-supported initiative in New York State. And New York State is a very liberal state. There are a lot of folks who are moderate Democrats who oppose the idea. Now, again, we can debate whether they're right or wrong, but it's very striking to see that in some ways the politics of this issue are moving because of the symbolic politics of the issue, people being offended by the president's rhetoric, and I think oftentimes with good reason. So then sometimes people think the politics of this issue, when it comes to substantive policy, have moved more than they really have. And I think that certainly for a lot of folks who serve in the Clinton and Obama administrations, they often think, well, wait a second, the politics of the issue when you're looking at some of the Democratic presidential candidates in 2020, it's moved a lot from where maybe the center of public opinion is in a durable way.
I talk a little bit about the politics because I think one of the things that accounts for why we've never had a truly comprehensive change. I mean, we're here trying to forge the next generation of immigration policy is because in the scheme of what people care about, immigration actually, unless it directly affects you and your family or your profession or your business, immigration actually is a catenary issue. People first think about jobs, they think about education, they think about healthcare. Immigration for a lot of people, except for that small group of us, I'm certainly one of them, who is very politically motivated around immigration issues, has historically not been a key political driver. It is not a voting decisional issue for people. And then the rest of the coalition of those of us who really are motivated in some way around immigration either have our particular select issue that we care about or our select interest for which we're advocating, and those end up being all over the place. So whenever we come on the eve of whether it was the George Bush legislation toward 2007, 2008, whether it was Senate Bill 744, just when you think you're about to cross the line,
right.
We don't. And that's because at the end of the day, there really isn't enough, it hasn't been, maybe there will be now, but there isn't enough political energy. Now, it makes great TV, and that's why we end up talking about it. That's why most of this room is full.
Well, and the president thinks it's a winning issue for elections, and so far it has been for him.
For some part of his coalition, without a doubt.
Let's talk a little bit about the sort of solutions. Raihan has a provocative book. I suggest you all read it, Melting Pot or Civil War. And one of the things you argue against is kind of this open border policy, Raihan, that some folks have sort of proposed. I think we could get into the left's proposals, but I'd rather focus on sort of how you see the landscape. One of the things you seem to be concerned about in terms of having a more open, more liberal immigration policy is assimilation, is the ability of immigrant communities to truly weave back into American society. Can you expand on that a little bit more and tell us why that matters now in a way that it didn't matter, say, with the Irish and the Italians?
Well, I certainly think it did matter with the Irish and the Italians, but this is, I don't want to filibuster, so I'll just talk about something really, really briefly. When you look at the history of the US, one really striking pattern you see is that from the late 18th century to the baby boom, you had declining birth rates that whole time. You literally had families that had 6, 7, 8 children. This was entirely common. And then starting in the baby boom, you had to flip back up. You had much smaller family sizes, you kind of went back up. And then family sizes have been going down again. So why am I talking about family sizes? Because actually family size for native-born folks has a really big effect on how immigration affects the composition of society. If the birth rates from the baby boom era had continued from, let's say, the late 60s to the present, even with the current levels of immigrant inflows that we've had for the past 50 or so years, which are not unusually high by the standards of American history, the foreign-born share of the population would be more like 6 or 7% rather than almost 14%. That's a dramatic difference. And that just tells you that for most of American history, even during periods of time when immigrant inflows were a heck of a lot higher than they are right now, still, immigrants were being massively outnumbered by children who were being raised by native-born Americans. So when you think about the kind of psychic landscape around immigration, a lot of it's affected by the fact that, when you have fewer children and your children have fewer children, then if you're an older person, when you look to the generation of your grandkids, actually immigration has a much bigger role in shaping that generation. Now, and I think that can be a great thing, that can be a wonderful thing, but it's also a pretty fraught thing. When you think about how so much of how we think about our common life is this idea of looking forward to the future. What kind of investments are we making? What kind of legacy are we leaving to the future? And in some cases, when you don't have that direct connection and you feel like younger generations are really different, they look really different, there's a different texture to them. So I think that when you look at the cultural politics of America right now, a lot of it is, funnily enough, an effect of that. If you had much larger native-born families, you'd have a lot more people who'd have kids going to school with folks who are from Burma or Jamaica or Bangladesh or Japan or what have you, or Mexico. You would have a very different kind of landscape. And I think that you often see in a place like the Bay Area, for example, people have different attitudes toward these issues when you actually experience it more directly. But then again, when you have that big generational rift, it's going to be a different story. So I as you can imagine, have a lot of thoughts about the policy dimension of these issues. But I really think that, funnily enough, that birth rate thing is actually a big part of the backdrop. And when you have fewer folks who are quote-unquote old stock Americans compared to new stock Americans and younger generations, that means that assimilation process is just going to work differently, almost by definition. You're going to have more communities that are more enclave-like. And I've got to tell you, when you're looking at those Irish and Italian communities, they really had a big, dramatic effect on the country. They had a big effect on the political economy of the country. And then when you look at that era of intermarriage and assimilation, that was an era when replenishment of those groups, the arrival of newcomers, really slowed down to a trickle. That was the area of great amounts of Italian and Irish intermarriage and what have you that gave rise to the kind of melting pot that we think of today. And I'm not saying that therefore you shut down the border. I think that would be a terrible mistake. But I do think that you need to be sensitive to that context.
Is that just, that's the sort of inescapable reality here as a changing face of America, and that certain ways, you look at demographically what's happening even with the native-born population, and the sort of dominant white culture is going to be at some point outnumbered by people of color in 2040.
I don't think that, so I think of it a little bit differently.
Well, I was directing that to Leon.
I'll just say briefly, I think that race and culture are really different things. That's all I'll say. Please. Perhaps Leon disagrees with me that race and culture are different.
I want to make sure.
Yeah.
I don't.
And I think one of the things that happens with both sides, to be honest, it is as Ryan says, it is fraught, and there will inevitably have to be give on both sides and uncomfortable realities for both sides. Politically, it doesn't feel like, you suggested that maybe the door was open to greater unity, but when you hear what is being proposed, I mean, yesterday night, the former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development suggested doing away with criminalizing a border crossing, which is a dramatic change in sort of where the left has been in a concrete fashion on immigration policy. And you couple that with where the right is, it is hard to imagine the two sides coming together on virtually anything as it pertains to immigration.
Again, that's where I think and it relates to what I was saying earlier, we need to be careful to not let this debate be defined either by its extremes or by the theater that it naturally generates. I have said and will always say two things. One, I still believe fundamentally that we are a nation of immigrants. I think we all believe that. And I think we all believe that immigrants can be of any race, they can be of any culture, any religion. I happen to also believe they can come from many different economic backgrounds. And I think that's still a core belief we have, and it is evidenced, among other things, by the fact that as we sit here today, hundreds and hundreds of people are getting their green cards.
Yep.
Hundreds and hundreds of people from every single country on the globe, even given the political rhetoric that we have, are being sworn in as U.S. citizens with their families watching, and they're going to have a party after that naturalization ceremony. So I think that spirit still persists. I do think we have a national consensus around it. I do think we do need to tackle make a national decision about and reach a natural consensus about where we are on the issues of humanitarian immigration,
right.
Refugees, asylees, temporary protected status. I do think that persists as a painfully divisive set of issues. And we also need to reach decisions on the degree to which we want to have a pathway for lower skilled immigrants. And I think those remain as areas of division. I think maybe to some degree those are racially driven, but I actually still have enough faith in us as a country that they're not.
The skills piece I want to get to before we go to the Q&A, because Raihan, you bring up a really interesting, there's a debate. The administration would like to see, or at least if you listen to Jared Kushner's, skills-based immigrants sort of getting preferential treatment, or the idea is if we're going to let more folks into this country, they should be higher skilled workers, right? One of the things you talk about in your book is a multi-generational approach and a mono-generational approach. There's been a lot of talk about chain migration on the right, which is the idea that you come over here and you get to bring your family over here because of the way U.S. immigration policy works. In Canada, Australia, and Singapore, they have these kind of two tracks, right? Mono-generational is for lower skilled workers who just come over by themselves, they can't bring their family. And then multi-generational is citizenship that is conferred upon those who have higher skills and they can bring their families with them. Is that right?
Yep.
Can you explain a little bit about what you find attractive about this sort of two-tier, or potentially a pathway for both sides to maybe agree on something?
So this is, there's a lot to get into here, and I encourage all of you to read my book, where I go into it in greater detail. But very briefly, so there are a lot of countries that embrace guest worker migration, and that guest worker migration confers very limited rights and benefits on the folks who enter as guest workers. And then they have another track for folks who are granted permanent status. My view is that the United States system, the nature of our constitutional system is that you want to create some kind of broad consensus. And what I see is that there's not a lot of appetite for drastically reducing immigration levels. There's not a lot of appetite for drastically increasing them. There is a plurality that favors keeping the numbers roughly the same. Now, we can debate whether or not that's a kind of sensible policy, but when you look at actually the way our policy works, there's some really funny aspects to it. So one is that when you're looking at family-based migration, it falls into two really different categories. One is for people who are considered immediate relatives, and that means minor children, spouses, and also the adult parents of adult US citizens. So one funny thing is that when people talk about the virtues of immigration, they often say, hey, we're an aging society, we need younger folks. But one result of this is that actually a pretty high proportion of all newcomers to the United States, green card holders, are actually over the age of 50. Or when you're looking at, so that's one family-based category, and then another family-based category are people who are, for example, the siblings of US citizens and what have you. A bunch of other people who fall into these family preference categories. And when you look at those family preference categories, there are people who are on really, really long wait lists just because their relative was originally from Mexico or the Philippines or China, rather than from Tuvalu or Lebanon or some other country that sends very few migrants. So that's another one of those inequities baked into the system. Now, one thing that I suggest in the book is saying that, look, for people who are in that family preference category, wouldn't it be sensible to say, we want to have other criteria? So if you're going to be otherwise on that wait list for 10 or 15 years, why don't we say that if you have a remunerative job offer, if you have acquired skills that are going to help you achieve self-sufficiency in the United States, we'll take that into account. We have an immigration system for humanitarian migrants. We have a refugee system, we have an asylum system. Those systems really need to be updated and modernized in all sorts of ways where I think Leanna and I might agree in some ways and disagree in others. But when it comes to the other system, there is this classic idea that we expect newcomers to be able to provide for themselves and their families. And I think that in some ways tweaking our system in a changing economy would be something that would actually build support for immigration. If people felt like actually, we're setting some kind of system where people are not being misled. They're being given a clear sense of what it means to achieve a decent working or middle-class existence in which you don't need to rely on safety net benefits. I think that would be a great help and would also really shore up support for our immigration system. So much more to say about that, but happy to discuss it with any of you further.
Go ahead.
Okay. No, I mean, I think it's an intellectually interesting idea.
That means it hates it, by the way.
It does, at least initially, or at least I don't like it a lot, and that's because
good thing we have 4 minutes to hash
too
this
many.
out.
Yeah, no. I'm gonna cover it in the next 10, which is I've seen just too many painful situations in families, precisely because the grandmother can't come over. And because that family situation of being separated across borders ends up becoming a very disruptive, emotionally taxing thing for that family. And so while I think it's a very interesting idea, I think it needs a lot of thought because every time I look at a particular family that's going to be affected by that scheme, the results look.
Well, you're attributing an idea to me that I don't necessarily have. So one thing that the Canadians do, which is pretty interesting, is they have renewable long-term visas for parents, provided you provide that parent with health insurance. And I think when you're looking at long-term care insurance and what have you, this seems like a pretty sensible issue that a lot of Americans, I think, on the left and right would find pretty sensible.
Okay. It's like we could have a 3-day discussion on this topic. Yep. Everyone has lots to say. We have like a handful of minutes for questions. So if your question is a good one, raise your hand and make sure it's not a statement because a lot of people just like stating things. And please direct it to one of our 2 speakers on stage. Gentleman in the back.
Rehan, my question is, and I'm right here, if you look over here. Right.
He's in the way back in.
So the Center for Immigration Studies says there's about 300,000 births to quote-unquote illegal immigrants. The cost of a high-risk pregnancy is $55,000. That translates to $16.5 billion. I'm from New York City. I'm a Democrat, but I lived in San Diego in a very conservative district. When I talk to my people, they say, that's too expensive, regardless of the size of the economy and the size of healthcare. And I don't have a great answer. So when you think about that cost for the system, how do we justify it? We don't justify it by employment. We don't justify it by spending. Is that something we should be willing to bear?
We need to discuss this at greater length, but broadly speaking, what I'll say is that my opinion on this issue has shifted over the years. When you look at most market democracies, outside the Western Hemisphere certainly, you see that you don't have the same kind of policy of automatic birthright citizenship, regardless of the status of the parents. The difficulty is that there's a risk that when you change that policy of automatic birthright citizenship, there's a risk that you create stateless persons. You see this happen in the Persian Gulf, for example, and this could be something that could become a huge, a serious problem for the country, particularly given the scale of that migration. So my view is that you really want to address that issue at the front end by addressing visa overstayers, by addressing clandestine border crossers, by addressing that problem, because trying to address it through something that might require a constitutional amendment, which by the way is pretty unlikely in itself, is something that, first of all, would be extremely divisive and contentious, and also there would be all sorts of unforeseen risks for going down that path, but I'd be delighted to discuss it with you further
Are you
offline.
smiling, Leon?
No.
Okay.
I'm smiling
I didn't know
at
whether you wanted to get in
I
there.
have somebody who's been very eager to ask a
Oh,
question
okay,
here,
down
so
here.
That's why
Yeah, down here, was there someone?
yeah.
You don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to. Okay, great. Wait, just wait 1 sec, that mic's coming to you.
Hi, I'm Jessica, and my question is, I was curious, what do you see for the future of DACA? It's something that I paid a lot of attention to, and how, if any of you have any advice of advocating for its preservation and functionality in all forms.
There's two things. One, I actually do think that DACA will in some way survive. I think it's interesting that the Supreme Court has been very slow to take it up. Congress has been slow to take it up. I think there will be a day of reckoning in the future where either Congress will need to act and essentially create some permanent version of DACA with a path to citizenship or some other kind of permanent status. I tend to believe we're going to get there. I do think there is sufficient bipartisan consensus. I think it's going to be the hard part of it is I think it's going to be a cliffhanger until we get there. And I think there are going to be many, many times that it's going to look like we're not going to get there. It's still going to leave the problem that, in fact, we have a very large number of permanently undocumented, non-DACA eligible people in the United States. So while it's true that a lot of people do go back to their country, there is still now a very durable, long-staying group of people, mostly from Mexico, who have now made their lives here. And we still don't really have a political solution for what's going to happen with that population.
Cliffhanger is right, my friends. We do not know how the immigration story ends. It's an ongoing story. Thank you for your time. Thank you, gents, for your thoughts.